Hi, and welcome back to Reddit Confessions. Let me jump right in, no backstory, no fairy tale romance, no once upon a time. Just this. I wasn't supposed to win. I wasn't even supposed to notice. She made sure of that. See, when your wife starts flirting with other men in front of you, on purpose, it's not a cry for help. It's a test. A performance. A power move. And I failed it the first 100 times. Smiled. Nodded. Laughed too softly to be heard over her voice saying things like, "Oh stop, you're making me blush, my husband never notices when I wear red lipstick." She said it while sitting beside me at a bar. To a man I'd never met. She winked. He smirked. And I sat there like the houseplant that came with the booth. But I didn't walk out. I didn't yell or make a scene or confront her in a bathroom mirror while dramatic music played. No. I stayed. Because I thought, if I just held on long enough, if I just stayed patient and understanding and non-confrontational, eventually she'd realize I was the only one who actually loved her without an angle. She didn't. Instead, she got more creative. She started calling it just jokes. I only flirt with men I don't care about. You're being weird again, it's harmless. You'd flirt too if anyone ever looked at you. That last one, yeah, she said it with a smirk. Right before leaving me alone at a wedding reception to go dance with the groom's brother. Hands on hips. That slow kind of dancing people do when they've forgotten who they came with. And the bridesmaids? They watched me. Not her. Me. With pity. That was the night it clicked. Not in some Hollywood sense, like a light bulb going off. More like a frayed wire finally snapping in silence. So I stopped chasing. I stopped asking her to tone it down. I stopped trying to compete with her smirks or outwit her sarcasm or win back a woman who was busy auditioning for new attention every weekend. Instead, I leaned back. And I watched. And I listened. And I remembered every girl she ever called too emotional, or, kind of boring, the same women who'd always smiled a little too long at me when Briley wasn't looking. Let me ask you something. What do you think happens when the quiet, loyal husband finally gets noticed? You think the wife claps? Nah. She burns. And trust me, when I finally made my move. It wasn't a joke. It was surgical. But we're not there yet. Because before I made her friends laugh the way she used to, she did one last thing. One last joke. And that's what truly lit the fuse. It started with the shirt. Not the flirting. Not the passive-aggressive digs. Not the just jokes. Those had been happening for months already, maybe even longer. I'd lost track of how many times she'd tossed her hair and said something like, "I'm just being friendly, do you want me to be rude to people just to make you feel special?" No, what really triggered the beginning of the end was a blue button-down shirt I didn't recognize. I found it balled up in the laundry basket. Not mine. Not my size. And when I asked her, she didn't even flinch. Oh that? Probably Josh's. He left it here after game night. Josh. Her coworker. The one with a beard like a lumberjack and gym stories that made her laugh until she cried. I remember looking down at the shirt and asking, almost quietly, when was this game night? She didn't answer right away. Just kept scrolling through her phone like I was background noise. That night, I didn't sleep. I wasn't angry. I didn't punch a wall or storm out into the rain. I just laid there next to her, staring at the ceiling, wondering when I became the man who had to ask when strangers were in his home. And worse, when I stopped expecting an answer. But here's the thing about quiet men like me, we watch. We remember. And eventually, we reach a point where silence stops being survival, and becomes strategy. So I tried something new. I started playing along. When she flirted in public, I didn't get awkward. I smiled. I let her do her thing. When she made another backhanded joke about me to her friends, I laughed too, maybe a little too loud. It wasn't that I stopped caring. It was that I stopped bleeding for her entertainment. And that? Oh, she noticed. Because the moment I pulled back, she leaned in. Suddenly, she wanted to know where I was going. Who I was texting. Why I was dressing nicer, why I wasn't home by 7:30 sharp like always. The double standard. It practically screamed in neon. I told her I was reconnecting. Making new friends. She didn't like that. She didn't say it, of course. Briley would never admit insecurity, that would ruin her whole, cool, untouchable, persona. But I saw it in the way her voice changed whenever she asked me, so who was there tonight? She'd never asked that before. And it just so happened that Nicole was there. And Sabrina. And Reagan. Quiet, watchful Reagan, the one who always made sure everyone had enough ice in their drink and never interrupted when I was speaking. The opposite of Briley in almost every way. We were at our friend Mark's backyard cookout, one of those casual neighborhood things with cheap burgers and too much IPA. Briley was making her usual rounds, whisper laughing with guys she called just friends, flipping her hair and touching elbows like it was a contact sport. I was sitting in a plastic lawn chair, sipping a beer, when Nicole sat next to me. We started talking about music, not the kind Briley made fun of, but the stuff I actually liked. 10 minutes in, Briley walked past us and shot me a look. I didn't flinch. In fact, I leaned in a little closer and laughed at something Nicole said, not because I was trying to make Briley jealous, but because I genuinely enjoyed the moment. And Nicole noticed. She put her hand on my arm. It stayed there. That was the first real warning shot. Briley stormed out that night without saying goodbye. When I got home, she was already in bed, wide awake, scrolling through her phone like it owed her an apology. "You seemed pretty cozy with Nicole," she muttered. I looked at her. "You seemed pretty cozy with every guy who wasn't married." She didn't respond. Just rolled over and shut off the lamp. But I didn't stop there. "You wanted just jokes, Briley. Okay. Let's see how funny it gets when I start laughing too." The next morning, the house was full of silence. Not peaceful silence. Not the kind where you sip coffee and enjoy the stillness together. This was weaponized silence, sharp, loaded, and humming with tension. Briley moved through the kitchen like a ghost, opening cabinets harder than she needed to, slamming the fridge shut like it owed her answers. I was at the table, casually scrolling on my phone, pretending not to notice her glances. She didn't speak to me. I didn't speak to her. And I swear, it was the calmest breakfast we'd had in a year. But the real shift happened that afternoon. I got a text from Sabrina, one of Briley's closest friends. And by closest, I mean the kind of friend who knew all of Briley's secrets, helped her pick outfits for girls' nights, and had probably laughed at more jokes about me than I could count. The message said, "Hey. That thing you said about the lake house last night, was that real?" It took me a second. Then I remembered, the night before, Nicole had mentioned her birthday was coming up, and I offhandedly joked that if she wanted a low-key escape, I still had access to my uncle's old lake house a few hours north. Nothing fancy, just a place with a dock, a broken pool table, and no cell signal for miles. Apparently, Nicole told Sabrina. And now Sabrina was intrigued. So I leaned in. I replied. "Yeah. Totally real. I haven't been up there in a while, but it's quiet. Secluded. Good for clearing your head." What happened next was fast. A few hours later, I got a group text, Nicole, Sabrina, and Reagan. All asking if I was serious. If I was really offering. If I'd be cool if they tagged along for a weekend getaway. They framed it like a casual trip, just some friends getting out of town. But everyone knew what it was. A test. And this time, I was done failing. So I said yes. I didn't tell Briley. Not because I was trying to be sneaky, but because for the first time in years, I didn't feel like explaining myself. She'd walked into countless parties without telling me. She disappeared into group chats full of laughing emojis and heart reactions and "he's just a friend" disclaimers. She taught me that in this marriage, transparency was optional. I was just following the syllabus. So, that Friday, I packed a bag. Jeans, sweatshirts, nothing fancy. I left a note on the counter that read, "Taking a weekend for myself. Don't wait up." And I left. Now, before you assume anything, no, it wasn't like that. Not yet. This wasn't some sleazy revenge plot. There were no hotel beds or dim lighting or whispered regrets. What happened at that lake house was something Briley never gave me. Attention. Respect. Space to speak without being laughed at halfway through a sentence. We arrived just before sunset. Nicole drove. Sabrina brought snacks. Reagan showed up with 3 bottles of wine and a Bluetooth speaker that barely worked. The place was dusty, the lights flickered, and the water smelled faintly like iron, but no one cared. For the first time in forever, I laughed. Not because I was covering up hurt or trying to ease a tension in the room, but because I actually felt seen. We made a fire. Played cards. Talked. Sabrina asked about my job and actually listened. Reagan admitted she used to think I was quietly hot, in that sad bookstore guy kind of way. Nicole leaned her head on my shoulder when we watched the stars from the porch. That night, nothing happened. And yet, everything changed. Because for the first time, I realized I wasn't the problem. I wasn't broken or boring or too sensitive. I had just spent years being measured by someone who had no intention of valuing me. And when Briley called me at midnight, twice, I didn't answer. She texted, "Where the hell are you?" I didn't respond. She tried again, 5 minutes later. "Are you with someone?" Still nothing. Nicole glanced at the buzzing phone on the armrest and whispered, "Want me to toss it in the lake?" I laughed. But this time, it wasn't bitter. It was free. And that sound? Briley heard it the next day. The morning after the lake house was one of those crisp, golden mornings where everything feels just slightly unreal. Birds were loud. The dock creaked softly. Coffee tasted better than it had in years. Nicole was curled up with a blanket and a mug, Reagan was barefoot by the water-skipping stones, and Sabrina was playing something old school on the speaker, humming along like she hadn't just watched my entire world tilt on its axis the night before. I had left my phone off. Not silenced, off. No buzzing. No screen lighting up with new pings. Just me and the quiet weightlessness of being unreachable for once. But eventually, I turned it back on. 17 missed calls. 11 from Briley. 4 from unknown number, which I later discovered was her calling from a coworker's phone. And 2 from a number I didn't recognize but suspected was Josh, the guy with the shirt. The guy from game night. There were texts, too. Briley. I woke up and you were gone. What the hell, Alden? Briley. Are you seriously ghosting your wife? Real mature. Briley. You're acting like a child. Come home. The last one was sent at 4:17 a.m. If you're with someone, don't bother coming back. I stared at that message for a long time. The irony of it all, her setting boundaries she never respected herself, was almost funny. Almost. I didn't reply. Instead, I handed my phone to Sabrina and asked, "Is it normal to feel absolutely nothing reading that?" She looked at me and said, "It's called peace." Later that day, Nicole sat next to me on the dock, our feet in the water. The lake was cold, but grounding. She didn't try to fill the silence. That meant more than any advice could have. Eventually, she asked, "So, what happens when you go back?" And I said, "I think she expects me to crawl." Nicole didn't laugh. She didn't roll her eyes or feed me some inspirational quote. She just said, "Then maybe don't." I didn't answer. But I knew something had shifted. Briley didn't know it yet, but the version of Alden who sat politely through her flirtations and smiled through the shame, that man drowned in the lake the night before. And the one who was slowly drying off. He wasn't planning on going back to that old role. We drove back Sunday afternoon. The mood was light. Reagan sang along to everything. Sabrina fell asleep with her sunglasses still on. Nicole offered to drop me off last. When we pulled up in front of my house, our house, Briley was sitting on the front porch, arms crossed, phone in hand like she was rehearsing lines. I stepped out of the car. Nicole didn't move. Briley's eyes scanned the vehicle, first me, then her, then back to me. I watched it happen, the exact moment her expression changed. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't jealousy. It was fear. And it was delicious. "Where have you been?" she asked. I didn't answer. Just walked past her and unlocked the front door. She followed, fast. "Seriously, Alden, what is this? You disappear for 2 days without a word and now you're just going to ignore me?" I dropped my bag by the door. Calm. Still. Centered in a way that seemed to freak her out even more than yelling would've. "You said you wanted space," I said. I finally listened. "That's not what She stopped mid-sentence. "Are you trying to punish me?" I turned and looked her straight in the eye. "No. I'm just not interested in being your joke anymore." She blinked. Once. Twice. I kept walking, straight into the bedroom. Locked the door. Turned off my phone again. And I kid you not, read it. I slept like a rock. The strange thing about silence is that, at first, it feels like power. For the next 2 days, Briley didn't bring up the lake house. She didn't ask who was there. She didn't make any jabs or jokes. Nothing. Just this artificial calm that hovered between us like a curtain, thin, but enough to pretend things weren't unraveling. She cooked dinner. She picked up extra groceries. She even folded my laundry, which she hadn't done in at least 6 months. It was eerie, like watching a broken clock suddenly tick again and wondering when it would explode. I said nothing. I wasn't playing mind games. I just couldn't pretend anymore. Not after what I had felt at the lake house. Not after remembering what it was like to be spoken to like I mattered. By the 3rd evening, Briley cracked. We were eating in silence, grilled chicken, green beans, some overly complicated quinoa thing she made from Pinterest to reset our habits, and she just dropped her fork mid-bite and said, "You think you're better than me now?" I didn't flinch. I was expecting it. The calm phase was over. This was her switch to confrontation mode. "You leave without telling me, ignore my messages, come back like some wounded monk who's found enlightenment, and now what? I'm just supposed to act like you're the victim." I leaned back in my chair. Slowly. Quietly. And I said, "No one's the victim, Briley. But I'm definitely not your clown anymore." Her mouth opened. Closed. She didn't have a comeback ready. That shook her more than any yelling would have. "You've been flirting with men in front of me for over a year," I continued. "You've made me the punchline at every party we've attended. I've spent nights wondering if I was just too sensitive, too boring, too whatever. And the truth is, I was just too patient." She stood up. "You're overreacting. You know I never meant any of that seriously." "No, Briley. You meant it. Maybe not cruelly, but casually. And that's almost worse. Because it means you never even noticed how much it hurt. She crossed her arms. So what, now you want to punish me by cozying up to my friends? I looked at her. Long and level. I didn't plan that. But they treated me with more respect in one weekend than you have in a year. Her face turned pale. And not in that angry, ready to fire back way. This was realization. She hadn't expected me to grow a backbone. She hadn't expected me to see what was outside of her orbit. And she definitely hadn't expected them to step out of it with me. That night, she tried to be sweet again. Wore the perfume I used to love. Crawled into bed and pressed her head to my chest like she used to when things were good. I didn't push her away. But I didn't hold her either. And in the darkness, I could feel her panic. Not loud. Not desperate. Just this quiet unraveling of someone who realized she had pulled the rope one too many times. The next day, I got a message from Nicole. Just one line. So, you ready to talk about what really happened at the lake? I stared at it for a long time. Because the truth was, something had happened. Something small, but real. Something I hadn't told anyone. Not even Briley. Especially not Briley. And suddenly I knew, this wasn't over. It was just beginning. I never answered Nicole's message right away. Not because I didn't want to, but because, for once, I wasn't rushing to fix someone else's expectations. I sat with it. Let it sit on my phone screen like a book I wasn't ready to finish. My whole life, I had been a responder. I cleaned up messes, soothed moods, filled silences, and played peacemaker in my own slow collapse. But now, I was letting things breathe. Letting people wait. And Briley hated that. She noticed immediately. She hovered more. Asked more questions. Made random comments that had nothing to do with anything, like, funny how some people just love attention, or, it's cute when people mistake pity for affection. Petty. Sharp. A little too obvious. But I didn't give her the satisfaction of reacting. Instead, I started writing again. It was something I hadn't done in years, journaling, if you want to call it that. I pulled out an old notebook from my desk drawer and began scribbling thoughts, moments, fragments of who I had been before this relationship turned me into a ghost of myself. I wrote about the lake. About the way Reagan listened. The way Nicole leaned her head back when she laughed. The way Sabrina didn't interrupt or deflect when I talked about my insecurities, she just nodded, like she saw me, and didn't need to change anything. I didn't romanticize it. I didn't pretend it was more than it was. But I also didn't lie to myself, something meaningful had happened at that lake house. Something that cracked me open. And once you've breathed clean air, you can't go back to the smog. 3 days after Nicole's message, I finally replied. Let's talk. You free tonight? She replied almost immediately. Thought you'd never say it. I didn't lie to Briley about where I was going. I just didn't offer information she hadn't earned. Going out, I said while grabbing my jacket. Don't wait up. She didn't ask where. But I could feel her eyes on my back as I walked out the door. Nicole and I met at a quiet little cafe downtown. One of those places that serves coffee late and plays vinyl records because it makes people feel cooler than they are. She was already at a table when I arrived, sipping tea like she had all the time in the world. When I sat down, she looked at me and said, "You don't look afraid anymore." "I'm not," I said. And I meant it. We didn't flirt. We didn't make plans. We just talked. And somewhere between sharing stories about how we met our respective partners and laughing about how none of us really knew what we were doing in our 20s, she leaned in and asked. "So, are you staying?" She didn't say Briley's name. She didn't have to. And for the first time since the marriage began to rot from the inside, I didn't feel the need to defend it. I just looked her in the eye and said. I don't think I've been in it for a while now. I just didn't know how to admit it. Nicole reached across the table and touched my hand. It was brief. Soft. No promises. But it meant more than any romantic gesture I'd seen in years. We didn't kiss. We didn't do anything reckless or impulsive. But when I left that cafe, I knew something Briley hadn't realized yet. The power dynamic had shifted, and she couldn't charm, guilt, or shame it back into her hands. The next day, she tried anyway. I came home to candles. Soft music. Her in that dress she hadn't worn in months. The one she knew I used to love. "Alden," she said, walking toward me with that carefully calculated smile. "Let's reset. No more tension. Let's just be us again." I didn't speak right away. I looked at the table she had set. The wine glasses. The way she had tried to recreate a memory she never truly valued when it was real. And I realized, this wasn't love. This was survival. Her survival. She thought I was drifting. She didn't realize I had already left. The candles flickered gently across her face as she waited for my reaction. That dress, the emerald green one she only wore on special occasions, clung to her like a memory she thought she could weaponize. The wine was already poured. Music low and nostalgic, clearly chosen for effect. The scent of my favorite meal floated from the kitchen, but it all felt artificial, like a movie set built to distract from the fact that the actors hated each other when the cameras weren't rolling. I didn't sit down. I didn't even take off my coat. She took a step closer. "Alden, please. Just, give me a night. Let's just talk. Laugh. Be us again." That word, us, rang hollow. I don't even think she realized how little it meant anymore. The version of us she wanted back was a one-sided performance, starring her, with me as the quietly supportive backdrop. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lash out. I just said, "You've never wanted to be us, Briley. You've always wanted to be you, with an audience." She blinked, like she hadn't prepared for that line in her mental script. "This," I gestured to the dinner setup, "this is just another scene. Another chance to pretend nothing happened. But it did. And I'm not pretending anymore." She laughed, sharp and disbelieving. "You spent a weekend with a few of my friends and now you think you've had some kind of awakening?" "No," I replied. "I think I spent a weekend being treated like a person. And it made me realize how badly you've trained me to accept being invisible." That silenced her. Not because she agreed, Briley never agreed, but because I think, for the first time, she realized she'd lost control of the story. I walked past her, into the kitchen, grabbed my keys from the counter. She followed. "Where are you going?" Her voice cracked. "Out," I said. "With her?" Her lip curled, voice trembling more from insecurity than rage. I turned to face her fully. "You didn't care who I was with when you were texting Josh at midnight. Or when you laughed at Liam's jokes about my job. You didn't care when you danced with strangers or when you told your friends I was too emotional to take seriously. So don't suddenly start pretending this marriage is sacred now." Her eyes welled up, not theatrical, not manipulative. This time it was real. And oddly enough, I didn't feel satisfaction. Just clarity. "I made mistakes," she whispered. "But you're not innocent either." "No," I agreed. "I stayed too long. I believed in potential instead of reality. And I let you chip away at my dignity one joke at a time." I walked to the door, hand on the knob, then paused. "You want to know the difference between you and Nicole?" I asked. She didn't respond. She didn't have to. Nicole looked at me like I mattered. You looked at me like a tool. And I finally got tired of being used. And then I left. Not with a bang. Not with screaming or broken dishes or dramatic exits. Just silence. A silence filled with all the words I didn't need to say anymore. I didn't go to Nicole's place. Not yet. I drove around the block. Parked at a lookout point that overlooked the city lights. And I breathed. For the first time in years, my lungs didn't feel heavy. My phone buzzed. A single message from Reagan, out of the blue. "She's spiraling, huh?" I smiled, despite everything. "Yeah," I replied. "But I'm not." I looked out across the hills. My marriage hadn't ended in a courtroom or a shouting match. It ended in quiet moments, jokes that cut too deep, texts left unanswered, smiles meant for anyone but me. And now, I was writing the final chapter. The next week was quiet, not the kind of cold, punishing silence that used to hang in our house after a fight, but the kind that feels like fresh air after a storm. I moved out without drama. No screaming, no threats, no cruel words. I just packed what was mine, left a note with the name of a good divorce lawyer, and locked the door behind me. Briley didn't beg. She didn't chase. Instead, she sent one last message the night after I left. "You were never meant to change. I liked you better before." I didn't reply. Because the truth is, I did change. And thank God I did. The version of me who stayed silent when I was embarrassed in public. Gone. The guy who believed that being the stable one meant swallowing his feelings. Gone. The man who was too afraid to believe he deserved more. That man was gone. Nicole and I didn't start dating right away. We gave it space. Time. We talked. A lot. She told me she was scared Briley would blame her for everything. I told her I didn't care. The truth is, Nicole wasn't the reason my marriage ended. Briley was. She just helped me see it more clearly. One evening, maybe a month later, we went back to the lake house. Just us this time. No drama. No secrets. Just two people sitting on the porch, wrapped in blankets, feet propped up, watching the stars flicker above the water like they'd waited for us to finally show up and notice. She looked over at me and said, "You know, I always thought you were too quiet. Now I realize you were just trying to survive." And I said, "Now I finally feel like I'm living." It wasn't perfect. Life never is. But it was real. And that was enough. So, to everyone watching this, if you've ever been laughed at, dismissed, made to feel invisible in your own relationship, let this be your reminder. You're allowed to outgrow someone who made you shrink. You're allowed to say, enough, even if you're saying it quietly. And sometimes, walking away isn't the end of your story. It's the first real page. Thanks for watching this story on Reddit Confessions. If you've ever had a moment where you realized you were no longer the same person who stayed silent, share it in the comments. I'd love to hear your turning point. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow for more stories like this, only here, on Reddit Confessions.